Thank you, Zotko. It's a pleasure to be here. I first was at Monash in 1961, before most of you were born, and it's changed. It's changed quite a lot, and of course, I guess that one thing we know about in higher education is that change is with us and has been with us forever, from certainly then, before then, and it continues to this day. Also, we change as people, so I do want to assure you that this person in your program here is actually me. The photograph was taken 14 or 15 years ago, and I look at that and think, I'm not looking in a mirror. Anyway, colleagues, it's good to be here to talk about this important topic, this important issue. I didn't really know what to say, apart from thanks, and then hand over to Laura so that she's got 28 minutes to reflect. But I'll try to do the decent thing and be provocative and give her something that she can get her teeth into. Let me start by saying that, like most of you, many of you, I note the recent DACOLA report into postgraduate education. I know two things about that. Is one, that I agree with some of the stuff in there, probably not all, but that would be par for the course. But also the fact that they do comment that there have been many reviews and that they urge that there not be another one for 4 or 5 years. Because when they look through all of these reviews and comments and commentary on this topic, they discovered that there was a lot of convergence around a number of points. And I think that's true. And I don't intend to dwell on that, other than to say that there are some recurring themes which show that over that entire period of all of those reviews, as a sector, we've not responded particularly well. Well, nobody has responded, not the government, not the sector, not the individuals, not the institutions themselves have responded to some of what is probably, you would read as a self-evident issue that we ought to be pursuing with much more vigour than we have. So I think from what I read, and I'm not on the inside anymore, but from what I read, the government is going to embrace the recommendations in that review very significantly, if not entirely, and they will have an impact as the government would use the levers that it's got, which are basically and primarily financial, of course. Carrots and sticks to get some change in the sector, which is long overdue, I think we could reasonably say. So I think the one that I would focus on, though, is data. And they commented on it. I've commented on it frequently, because one of the most exasperating things you can do as a chief scientist, and I should say, of course, I was a Vice-Chancellor for 16 years, so I'm complicit in some of the problems that I'm about to identify. But, the fact that PhDs are classified under field of education and not research is, in my view, an absurdity. And it makes it very difficult to think in any way strategically about what we do. So it really came home to me when the government, I forget who was the Prime Minister, there were a few, but when one or other, the government had declared a very substantial area of the ocean around Australia as marine park. And I thought, well, that'll be interesting, how are we going to manage it, how are we going to work with it, what are we going to do with it? And so I asked the people who looked after me at the time to find out how many PhDs we had in marine science in Australia that year, and they couldn't tell me, because they're classified first under field of education. So if the university had a degree in marine science, they might have coded some of their PhD students as marine science, but it also became obvious that the fastest growing, this is in 2014, 13 or something, the fastest growing coded PhD area was not otherwise classified, because the universities didn't have to bother to classify it by field if they didn't want to, just made sure they got high cost, low cost, but they didn't have to bother to classify it. So you had this very substantial growth in not otherwise classified. Now, if I knew that and I were a minister, I would want that changed. I do not believe that it's sensible to pour public money into institutions that can't be bothered classifying, so that the person paying the bill doesn't actually know how many PhD students we are producing in particular areas. All we know is that we've got a lot. And some would argue that we've got too many. Some would argue that we've got too few. It's an argument you can have better if you actually know the evidential base for the argument. As do we have enough in physics? We couldn't tell you. Do we have enough in marine science? Wouldn't know. What about agricultural science? All we know is that the overwhelming majority are international students. What we do know is that our farming workforce is ageing, our research workforce in agricultural science is ageing, and what we do know is that Australian PhD students in agricultural science has dropped like a rock. We think, because we haven't got the data accurately. So I think that you can expect change there. And if I were you, I would lead the change rather than be swept along by it. Anyway, I'm not going to dwell at any great length on the ACOLA report and their findings. I'm going to share some observations that with you that I've made over many years. I've worked at a reasonable level and, well, multiple levels in 4 Australian universities, Wollongong, Monash, ANU and Flinders, all quite different institutions, different stages of development, different motivations, different pressures. And that leads to a different education when you're in each of those, because you learn something every day, not always what you want to learn, but you learn something every day. And those 4 institutions give you a perspective which is a really interesting one. And I also want to be a little bit provocative, because I do want to give Laura something to get her teeth into, but also I want to sort of have an exchange with you. So I'm not going to talk for a long time, although I seem to have talked for a long time already. But I don't want to. I want to actually get you to ask me questions and we can find out what you're interested in. Now, I put in the disclaimers early because otherwise I'll feel the eyes roll when I criticise something, and you'll be thinking, if only he knew that we did that, or we do that, or my institution does that. So the disclaimer is I'm going to speak generally. The other disclaimer is that I do know that there are excellent programs speckled through the Australian higher education system. Of that there is no doubt. I'm not going to say every institution has got one, but I am going to say that across the sector as a whole there are some truly excellent programs. But the point is that what we tend to do in Australia is we tend to regard the excellent as being the average. And when you look at an excellent program, it is not like that in every institution. You look at half a dozen excellent programs, not like that in every institution. And we have to actually be careful to make sure that we use our excellent programs to lift the average, to draw the average upwards, rather than just presume that it all must be great in the garden because somebody somewhere in some institution does something really well. They should be applauded, no doubt about that. They should be supported, no doubt about that. We should give them every encouragement to continue, no doubt about that. But you need a framework within which they can operate that supports them, does all the things for them, but at the same time drags the system forwards and upwards. And we do tend in Australia to use the best and presume that it's the average at least in our exchanges, when in fact we know it isn't. We look at our best researchers. I have no doubt from all the metrics that I've ever looked at, insofar as metrics are useful, I have no doubt that our best researchers are amongst the best in the world. But our average is not. So we have ministers going out there saying, oh, we punch above our weight. What a meaningless, stupid expression. What does it actually mean unless you know what weight class you're punching in? So we actually need to be realistic, and one of the things that I urge you to do as supervisors, as university people, is to be realistic about what's happening. Because when you ask yourselves the right questions, you can get the answers that you need to improve. When you delude yourselves into believing that everything is fantastic, then nothing's going to happen. And even worse, politicians will think they're so good we can cut their budget and it won't do any damage. You would be surprised, well, probably you wouldn't be surprised to know how many ministers have asked me, Ian, how come they can say on the one hand that they're fantastic and world class in everything they do, but they haven't got enough money to be any good? We've got to be realistic about how we approach the change that we want to lead rather than be swept along by. So with respect to PhD students, I would put it to you that across the country as a whole, speaking generally, that most of them are being trained like I was all those years ago. When I was saying outside, I knew more about 2 amino acids than anybody else in the world, you know, for a week or two, and then somebody published a paper and it was gone. But I knew a lot, but it was what happened to me while I was learning about them and using that knowledge to produce a thesis, what happened to me during that process that let me do some of the things that I've subsequently done, because I think I've never stopped thinking like that for the whole of my life, whether I've been a Deputy Vice-Chancellor or a Dean or a Professor or a Vice-Chancellor or a Chief Scientist. Embedded in my core are the skill sets that I developed while I was studying 2 amino acids in the active centre of one enzyme, which nobody in the rest of the world cared about, and I was never able to say that it would have an industry application. But it changed the way I thought, the way I acted, and I had a supervisor who encouraged me to think broadly and laterally, and not just think about the 2 amino acids, but what I was acquiring as I did that. So I was lucky. But I know too many PhD students are being prepared as if there's an academic career path ahead of them, as it was for me. I've spoken to postgraduate association groups in large numbers around the country over the last few years, and when I say to them that I had a tenured position halfway through my first postdoc, you can feel the temperature go down in the room by about 25 degrees, because that's not the present and it's not the future as far as we can tell. So I was of a generation that was lucky. I could be encouraged to learn a lot about those 2 amino acids, and at the same time I could anticipate that I'd get a job like my supervisors, and I did. But if you look at the data now and you look at the surveys, you find that 50, 60, 70% of PhD students would hanker for an academic position, but about 20% will get one. What are we doing for PhD students? Why is it that we're still encouraging them to think like that, when in fact we all know that only for a proportion of them, a relatively small proportion of them, will that come to pass? So I think we've got to now do something beyond the rhetorical commitment. I've heard it said so many times that I don't hear it anymore. So it's probably even more times than I've actually heard, if that's true, that there is no single purpose for a PhD, and we've got to try to find ways of preparing people to expose them to the options that are available to them as a highly trained, highly sophisticated, very fertile thinker. Most often young, not always when they graduate, but most often young, at the young end, especially in the sciences. And what are the options that are available to them? And part of the process of learning that goes through with a PhD ought to be opening minds to options and not just limiting or expectations. Because for me it's pretty simple. If we're going to make this country better, and if we're going to make this country something that we'd like to hand on, as I've often said to coming generations, if it's going to be more secure, if it's going to be positioned well in a competitive world, then I think we can't leave it as it is, so that very largely, not exclusively, very largely, most of our, or many of our most talented young people, talented people, are trained as if there's only one option for them, and then they get disappointed when that doesn't come to pass. Now I think if we accept that we've got to act rather than just say it again, and again and again and again, because that's what we've done, to my certain knowledge, for at least 25 years, 35 years. If we're going to do something, it means that action has got to be taken, and action, I think, falls broadly into 3 or 4 groups. To universities, what is the purpose of a PhD? Do we actually know what it is? You know, in my day it was to do an original piece of research you could wrap between covers, and in my case defend orally before a couple of people who knew something about your field, one of whom read it on the train on the way up to do the oral examination. But we sort of had a clear idea of what it was for, because we had a clear idea of what the options were at the end of that period. And it's not like that now. So what is the purpose of a modern day PhD? And I think it is about giving people deep discipline knowledge in an area. I think we should ever forego the disciplines. We talk about interdisciplinary research. You can't have good interdisciplinary research if you don't have strong disciplines. So it is important that we get the disciplines in order, and that we make sure that a PhD in physics, whatever area of physics, is really deep knowledge in that area. But wrapped around it as part of the process of learning, there are other skills that are being developed at the same time. Presentational skills, critical thinking skills, analytical skills, quantitative skills, whatever they might be. Because we've got to say to that person, you might do that PhD in that area, and so I won't quote an area in physics because I'll get it wrong. So going back to my case, you might know more about 2 amino acids in one enzyme than anybody else in the world for a week, but you won't ever work in that field ever again. Or you may not. Or you may for a postdoc, but you'll go off and you'll be a Vice-Chancellor or something. Not at the age of 32, but although I was only 32 when this photograph was taken, it's going to be quite different for them. So I think the university has got to be very clear, and I think it's a responsibility of the supervisors and to the students, and to the taxpayers as a whole, taxpayer community, because they're paying for the large share of it. Whatever we think about, whether it's enough or not, $13 billion a year goes in, and I think we need to be clear about why we're doing it. I think there are things that we have to say that it isn't. It shouldn't be just cheap hands doing research to lift a publication output from a university, you know, for whatever it is, 18, 20 grand a year or something, or less, or more, but not a lot more if it's more. It shouldn't be just seen to be that, and it is in a lot of places. You would be surprised at the number of people, like at Vice-Chancellor level. So before I became a Vice-Chancellor, I used to work for the Commonwealth, that Vice-Chancellor would say, oh, we need, in the old profiles days, we need 50 PhD student places. Why? Well, we've got to build our research capacity off the back of PhD students in institutions that had very few staff with a PhD and almost no infrastructure. So the idea was embedded 20 or 30 years ago that these were important people in the developing of research in an institution. That remains true. But it's not a source of cheap labour to get publications to lift a university up the ranking profile. And it should never be so. So the purpose of a PhD has got to actually work and identify what it is that a particular institution, it'll be different at Monash from, you know, somewhere else, and it should be different. Cultures are different, purposes are different, ambitions are different, motivations are different, infrastructure is different, capability is different, and so we can prepare some differences and differentiate a bit. I think universities also have to be willing to prioritise. They've got to say no sometimes. In my experience as a Vice-Chancellor, I just lost count of the number of people who would say yes to anybody because of the aforementioned reason. And I don't think that's good enough. And I think universities ought to be willing to say no, but also to prioritise. There are areas, probably in every university, but I can't speak for every university, but in most universities that I've visited, well, that happens to be all of them, so I could say in all universities, there are areas that should not have PhD students. But a university Vice-Chancellor has to be a brave person to say no sometimes to a belligerent, hostile, aggressive, typical professor. Well, I never met any of those either, but they always wanted what they wanted. But prioritising, I think, is important, and I think that's important for supervisors, it's important for students, and it's important for the projects themselves. We've got to get rid of this notion that we don't build scale, and I've already mentioned it, but it is really, it's sort of an endemic part of the culture. The Commonwealth Government funds about 150 separate programs in R&D across 13 portfolios with almost no linkages between them except by chance. Now you can be generous and say, well, let's cut out the ones under 10 million. So there's still 50 or so. And one of the reasons for that is that there are people who do not like to say, let's spend 500 million on this project just in case it goes wrong. They'd rather spend 10 times 50 than 1 times 500. And universities have fallen into that trap too. So they're spreading. And they're spreading and they're thinning as they spread because the resources in the top are not directly proportional to the rate of spread. And I think that that's got to change if we're going to be serious about how we prepare PhDs for the future that they will confront. And of course there's the gender issue within especially science and technology, engineering and mathematics for that matter, all the STEM disciplines, where the proportion of young women in the earlier years of study is quite high, but in the more senior academic positions is remarkably low. And the government can develop programs to support it, but at the end of the day it's the universities that have to do something about it and get over the fact that we've had this debate for 30 years and the numbers have barely changed. So again, it's converting rhetorical commitment to action so that we change the way we operate. For supervisors, it means actually taking a slightly different, well, first of all, it means supervising. When I was first at Flinders as a young academic, I used to have to sign off on the student reports that came in about their supervision. And the number of students, particularly in areas that I won't mention but are not STEM, they see their supervisor once a year. Is that supervision? How can it be supervision? How can you be developing those additional skills in a student if all you do is see them once a year, probably over a port or a sherry or something, and say, how you doing? Well, oh, that's all right, nick off, next. It's inadequate, it's inappropriate, and if you know people who do that, then the senior people in your university should know, so action should be taken, because it is just totally inappropriate behaviour. But it happens. I think supervisors have a particular role in expanding the horizons of their students, in which case they've got to meet them, of course. And I know it's different and there are cultural differences and genuine reasons for some of the differences between, say, the STEM disciplines and the HASS disciplines. But we've got to get better in both. And expanding horizons of the students is one thing, and preparing them for multiple options at the end, and not encouraging them to believe that they've got a full-time career as a researcher ahead of them, I think is also important. Business has got to get more active. Presently, they have about 20% of Australia's researchers self-defined as researchers. And of course, it's one of the reasons why we have the gap between us. Even the language we use is often different. But what they've got to do is stop complaining and get active and get realistic. I know as a Vice-Chancellor, I've never sat across the table from a businessman who wanted the university that I was in at that time to do some research for them, who ever wanted to pay the full cost of research. Ever. They always expected it to be a hidden public subsidy of the research and development that they might or should be doing themselves. And that's got to change. You can't continue like that. They can't continue like that. The universities can't say, yep, give us the money and nick off and we'll give you some papers at the output. The number of people who criticise, say, the linkage grant scheme to me as Chief Scientist was, an academic comes along and says, I've got a great idea, here it is. Sign here, they sign the linkage program, the money gets funded, they see the researcher 3 years later and say, here are 5 papers. I'm not saying that that's uniform, and I did say at the beginning that I was speaking in general terms, but it happened too often for it to be just an isolated, idiosyncratic behaviour of a couple of individuals. So we've both got to get more realistic about that. But the business community has got to get a lot more active, and it's got to stop complaining and be much more constructively engaged with the way that the universities might change. And then there are governments. So I'm one of the firm believers. I mean, I would be labelled by some people as an interventionist. I think if we elect a government to spend vast quantities of taxpayers' money, the government has got a role, and it's got to account to us for how it spends the money, and the institutions that are given the money have got to account to the government on how it spends the money on our behalf. So I don't think I'm a gross interventionist, but I do think that there are some obligations and responsibilities that go with privilege. And at the end of the day, it's a privilege to be a member of a university. It's hard work. It's not like it used to be when I was young. It is hard work. I accept all that. I accept circumstances have changed a lot, but it's still a privilege. And when you see what other people have to do to earn a crust, it's an even bigger privilege, and with that privilege goes responsibility. So we have a responsibility to government to justify why they give us money. We have responsibility through them to the taxpayer to explain why it's worth investing in us. And I think we should be willing to do that without demur. I don't think it's unreasonable at all. But then the government has got some responsibilities to us. First of all, they've got to lead. Long time since you would have used that word to describe government. They've got to make their expectations clear, and they've got to be consistent, and they've got to be coherent, and they've got to stick to them for a while. There's got to be a policy framework within which we can operate and exercise our autonomy. So yeah, I'm still a Vice-Chancellor at heart. I still believe that institutional autonomy is important, but I don't believe it's unlimited. I don't believe that you can do anything you feel like doing whenever you feel like doing it at whatever rate you feel like doing it, as long as the taxpayer pays for it and no questions are asked. I believe that there is a national interest, and that national interest is in part served by our education system and in part served by our universities. And government policy framework facilitates that contribution that universities make. And we need it, and we need it to be stable. I saw the Minister for Education the other day talking about how we need some bipartisan support for whatever it is that he's going to come up with. Well, you know, that's true. I'll just remind you that in the time I was Chief Scientist, which was a tad under 5 years, there were 4 Prime Ministers. There were 6 ministers with responsibility for science. There were 3 heads of the department, Commonwealth Department, with responsibility for science. There was only 1 of the Education Department, but 6 ministers. And as you know, my most famous speech was at the Prime Minister's Science Prizes, when I reminded the audience that of the 6 ministers, 3 of them were named Christopher. So I said, if anybody out there has the name Christopher and no qualifications in science, then they have a 50% chance of being the next science minister. The present science minister at that time, who happened to be named Christopher, can be heard in the background saying, "What about me?" But you can imagine that with that change, it's hard to get consistency. They're all decent people. They work hard. I wouldn't be a politician for quids, you know. They work. The ones who rise up, particularly, they work really hard. All of those ministers, in their own way, worked hard. Some of them were not interested in science at all. Some of them were deeply committed to science. So you get a difference between the policies that one lot would produce, one of them would produce, or directions or hopes or aspirations that they would articulate from some of the others. And the same with the Prime Ministers. You know, Gillard, Rudd, Abbott and Turnbull, you could hardly find 4 more different personalities on the planet if you could search everybody on the planet. They were completely different people. They had different interests and different aspirations. And although they don't drive huge change in the short term they're in the position, they nevertheless tinker with it, fiddle with it, influence it, and so you do get change. And so I think that we do need some critical bipartisanship in some of these areas, so that a policy framework gives you the opportunity to know that whatever you're doing and trying to lead some of that change will be embedded in there for at least 4 or 5 years, and there won't be another review every 6 months, again fiddling at the margins. And we think that we're changing things because we have these reviews. Oh, you know, I'd fiddle with that bit, or I'd fiddle with this bit, or I'd increase the scholarships from 3.5 to 4 years, or something like that. All of those are important, but they're not actually changing the main game, and they're not encouraging us to engage in the right way that we do it. So government has got to be willing to build scale. They've got to be willing to prioritise in order to build scale. And I think at the moment we do face a particular issue because of the demand-driven funding. I mean, you could end up with a university, just to illustrate the point to you, Max, rather than anybody else, but we could end up where every undergraduate wants to study economics. Could you think of anything worse than that? And on top of that, you employ staff to teach those students economics, so that's your research profile. Do we let the research profile of this country be driven by the undergraduate study patterns and profiles? And how do we get in the way of that if we want to? There's an important role for government to work with the universities and not beat them up, but to work with the education system and not beat it up. But it also requires some hard decisions to be made where not everybody is going to be happy and not everybody will vote for them at the next election, which in Australia comes around on average every 2.7 years. I'll leave you with a couple of questions then. First a comment. I would not, if I were you, underestimate the political resolve to link university research to business needs. This is, I think, bipartisan. I don't think that it means the end of basic research and understanding and the building up of knowledge. But it does mean that there will be a different emphasis for some people. I don't think anybody that I know in any part of the government or bureaucracy is saying that there is no room for basic research. But they're also saying that some of the basic research can be applied to a problem that needs to be solved, whether that's melanoma, broadband network, whatever it might be. It's building up the knowledge base of the country that's as important as being able to use the knowledge base. Otherwise, all we do is drain our intellectual capital and have nothing to replace it. So one of the questions for you is, how do you act before you're acted upon? I think as a sector, resolving some serious directions and being willing to implement them and going to government and say, you want us to change, this is how we want to change, this is how we could change, and this is how we need your support, is better than going and saying, we're all world class, every single one of us, roll of eyes, we're all world class, but if we had more money we'd be even as good as the universe, whatever's bigger than the world. And they don't like it, they don't accept it, nothing positive of any great note comes out of that approach. So working out what you want to do and how you could change and how you could lead, that change is important. Exerting your influence is important. To do that, it's got to be coordinated, it's got to be consolidated, it's got to be constructive. Too often I remember as a Vice-Chancellor that we'd agree on something only to find that some of the colleagues would be traipsing around the parquetry in Parliament House saying that's what they said, but I don't agree with it. And of course it's easy then for people to say, well, we consulted with them, but they don't know what they want. So it's important that we remember that one of the comparative advantages that this country has is you. Because you multiply by the 40% of the cohort that goes into universities and so on, and the TAFE colleagues pick up an extra substantial percentage, that we can produce in this country a population with exquisitely educated skills, led by people with PhDs all through the economy, all through the sectors, all through everywhere, including the universities. And we can build a country that's quite different from what we've got, because the one that we do have to build is going to need to be different from the one we've got. Self-serving behaviour aimed at prestige or rankings does not serve the nation well. It might help a Vice-Chancellor to feel happy, but it doesn't serve the nation well. And the sooner we accept that fact, the better. And the sooner we get real and rational about what our performance is really like, which, as I've said before, is very good in some areas, exceptionally good in some areas, but our average is not so good. I think that the final statement that I'd make on that last point is don't oversell the book. People find out, and it's not helpful to go around saying how good everything is, and then we find out that some of it isn't. So I think it's about being evidentially based. It's about being true to your beliefs and values, true to the values of a university in the real sense of the word, but it's about recognising that the real role of a university, or one of the roles of a university, importantly, can be to lead change and not just get swept along by what other people want to do to you. And then it's up to you. Thank you.